almost all of which are owned by big Eastern and foreign corporate interests, or by the government itself. As taxpayers, we're forced to pay billions of dollars every year to support the liberal CBC. But now even the non-government-owned mainstream media are on the take, receiving hundreds of millions of dollars a year in a massive taxpayer bailout from the federal government. This means that even those few bright spots of independence and free thinking in the mainstream media are now on the government dole and cannot speak without fear that the government could pull their funding at any time. There are a few great journalists in the non-government-owned media, but they mostly work for large corporate interests owned and operated out of Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and New York. Western voices, voices that speak for the West without fear of what their bosses in Toronto will say, are far and few between. The West needs a strong and independent voice that is willing to take on the issues facing our people. This is why we refounded the Western Standard in 2019. Since then, the Western Standard has burst onto the scene and shaken up Western Canada's media landscape. With a growing and dedicated team of reporters and opinion columnists, we have quickly become the third most read online news platform in Western Canada, with an average of 3 million readers per month and hundreds of thousands of people watching our videos and listening to our podcasts. Our news team is made up of credible reporters, largely recruited from the mainstream media, but who focus on issues that are all too often ignored by the old players. Our opinion columnists fearlessly take on controversial issues that most of the old players are too afraid to touch directly. The Western Standard's mission is to be the independent voice of the New West.
This is why we need to see the receipts. What did you actually spend the money on?
We got some major news breaking at the moment for you.
We're making a big difference and giving Westerners a homegrown alternative to the big, government-owned and government-funded mainstream media. We're changing the conversation.
Now, obviously, I condemn those symbols. I think those are...
For sure, we all do at the Western Standard.
What are your thoughts on that debate?
I think that Tom Clark, the moderator, certainly lost.
There's issues with the current ambulance system run by the province.
We refuse to accept a penny of the big media bailout that has corrupted Canada's once free press. Because we are one of the only genuinely independent media in Canada, we are able to speak freely and cannot be cancelled by Ottawa. We have a large and growing team of journalists with bureaus in Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, Regina, and on Parliament Hill. Our reporters and columnists are fearless and work tirelessly to give you straight news and cut through the spin. That is why we need you, the reader, to step up and become a member of the Western Standard. You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99 a year for unlimited access, much cheaper than a subscription to one of the big government-funded newspapers. We are reinvesting every penny of that back into improving our ability to provide you with real, independent, and original Western news and opinion coverage. Supporting independent media with your membership is the price of having any media left in this country that isn't on the government take. If you want there to be any independent Western media left, then we need you to step up and support it. Without people like you supporting independent media, all that will be left is the corrupt, government-owned, and government-funded press. We've built something great that is challenging the old media, and we're making a big difference. Together, we can make sure that we have a voice that speaks for a West that is strong and free.
Welcome and thank you for joining us today at the Western Standard's UCP Frontrunners debate. Before I begin, I want to thank all of our staff at the Western Standard who have worked so hard to pull off tonight's debate on a modest budget, a budget that I hope will be sufficient enough to ensure we have a good internet connection tonight to stream it online. I'm going to regret that if it's not. And speaking of budget, I want to thank the sponsors of this evening's debate first. The Alberta Community and Cooperative Association is the representative voice of over 700 cooperatives in Alberta, and Credit Unions of Alberta represents 14 credit unions with almost 200 branches located in communities large and small across Alberta. Supporting communities they operate in is a priority for credit unions, and they give where they live with annual charitable donations, fundraising initiatives, and sponsorships that support local, not-for-profits, and small businesses, and $84 million back to their members in 2021 through profit share programs. Other title sponsor tonight is the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. I love these guys. I've been a member of the Canadian Shooting Sports Association for over a decade because I trust them to be as Canada's leading gun owners' rights organization. In fact, Alberta and Saskatchewan's new provincially appointed chief firearms officers were both board members of the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. So, if you're not yet a member of the CSSA, you should be. Thirdly, I want to acknowledge and thank the Calgary Sky Palace. Rooftop Calgary. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. I want to thank Rooftop Calgary and its co-owner Brett Wilson for providing such a beautiful and convenient venue for tonight's debate. And the staff have been fantastic. Give them a round. They've been good to us, so please make sure you eat lots and drink more while you're here. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. This, I believe, will be one of the major inflection points of the UCP's leadership election. One of the three candidates who will be on stage in a moment will almost surely be the next Premier of Alberta. We made the tough call to limit tonight's debate to 3 frontrunners. Firstly, and as big as this place is, the stage just would be too small to comfortably fit more than 3 candidates. That's the easy answer. Secondly, there are already 2 other official United Conservative Party debates that will feature all 7 candidates, and I encourage everyone who's watching tonight at home or here to watch those debates as well. And most importantly, smaller debates tend to be more meaningful. They have more direct interaction between the candidates, see they're already talking, and allow them more time to get beyond the talking points. So we invited Mr. Brian Jean, Mrs. Danielle Smith, and Mr. Travis Toews based on the best scientific polling data that we could obtain. And based on that data, these 3 candidates are the far most likely to make it to the final 3 on the preferential ballot. Now, I also want to acknowledge one candidate who won't be on stage, but who is still with us here tonight, Mr. Todd Lowen. Where's Mr. Todd Lowen? You want to stand? Stand up, Todd. I served 4 years with Todd. He's a great guy, and if he's not on stage tonight, we should absolutely have a conversation with him and watch the other debates, because he's got some things that are definitely worth listening to. I felt a little bad not inviting other candidates. As some of you know, I'm a sucker for lost causes and have taken on my share of hopeless crusades. So please be sure to watch the remaining official party debate in Edmonton if you can. They deserve your consideration as much as those candidates who are with us tonight. But tonight is the frontrunners, and I'll bet anyone here that one of the men or women fighting it out on stage is going to be the next UCP leader and Premier on October 7th. So let's get to the ground rules. 1, no sad trombones. Applause is allowed, but try to keep it short and seldom. Candidates will be allowed an opening statement of 2 minutes each. If you go over that, I'll be a jerk to you. Corey Morgan will be right here beside me with time cards. If you see a yellow card, that means you have 15 seconds left and it's time to wrap it up. If you see a red card, that means you're done wrapping it up. There will be 19 questions, 20 questions. Math is hard. There will be 20 questions that fall under 6 themes. Alberta Strong, Alberta Free, Unity of Democracy. Please, God, give us one more oil boom. I promise not to piss it all away this time. Social programs, and a just Alberta. Specific questions will be put to the candidates, who will have 1 minute to respond. The other 2 candidates have been selected in advance for a 1-minute automatic rebuttal to the first candidate's answer. When a candidate specifically criticizes another candidate by name or strong implication, the moderator, that's me, may at my own discretion allow the criticized candidate a 1-minute ad hoc rebuttal. Closing statements of 1 minute per candidate will be made. Candidates are required to answer the questions directly. Failure to do so may result in me pressing the candidate to respond appropriately. Candidates are required to keep their statements, answers, and rebuttals within the allotted time. If they do not, it may result in me saying something mean to them or muting their microphone if they keep doing it. The questions tonight are going to be tough. If I do my job correctly, I believe all three will think I have it out for them. Candidates are invited to make themselves available at the conclusion of the debate for a friendly scrum with the local Calgary media who are with us tonight. So with that, let me invite the contestants up to the stage. Up first, the former Minister of Finance and the MLA for Grand Prairie Wapiti, Mr. Travis Toews. The former leader of the Wild Rose opposition, you still don't know which one I'm calling it, do you? And the MLA for Fort McMurray, Lac-La-Biche, Mr. Brian Jean. And lastly, a lot of people said, is Danielle canceling? No, there's just a bigger sign over top, so it doesn't look like I'm in drag. Lastly, the former leader of the official Wild Rock opposition and former radio show host, Mrs. Danielle Smith. All right. This first section, I think we got a little feedback. The first section is Alberta Strong. The first question is for Mrs. Danielle Smith. Your proposal of an Alberta Sovereignty Act has been one of the clear main topics of this leadership campaign. It attracted the scorn of varying degrees from all of your opponents, save Mr. Todd Lowen, and much of the media. You say that the Act will keep many federal attacks on Alberta from enforcement here, but your critics say that it will undermine the rule of law and investor confidence. How would you ensure that the Sovereignty Act does not undermine the rule of law and investor confidence?
Do I get 2 minutes? Because you said we were going to have 2 minutes for an opening statement, or is this just a 1 minute answer?
I was not following my own rules, so okay. Now you know. Now you know what it is. Okay, so 2 minutes, beginning with Mr. Brian Jean.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you to Derek and the Western Standard for putting on this event, and for everyone watching tonight, and for being here. I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, I'm a businessman, a former litigation lawyer, a former member of Parliament. I've also mopped floors, done a few odd jobs, driven tractors, run a printing press, and run a cash register. I'm running because I truly love Alberta like everybody up here. And I know that it's possible for Albertans to be the healthiest, the happiest, the most free and most prosperous people in Canada and the world under my leadership. I commit to ensuring that you have more autonomy in your lives, that you have more control of your life, more personal freedoms, personal autonomy, financial autonomy, professional autonomy, autonomy for communities, and of course, more provincial autonomy for Albertans within Canada. I believe you should have the biggest say in how you live your life. This means medical autonomy, choice in education, decentralizing government decisions as much as possible. It means reducing everyday costs for Albertans, working with our experts in agriculture, in energy, healthcare, and technology sectors to develop policies that will help them thrive. And it means going head-to-head with Ottawa to ensure Albertans get autonomy over our resources, as is guaranteed in the Constitution under Section 92, and get more autonomy with our Constitution. I am someone who means what they say and does that. I will not lie to you just to tell you what you want to hear. I have a proven track record of bringing positive results for the people of Alberta through listening, consulting, negotiating, and caring. I want to lead the UCP in a way that truly connects with people and works with Albertans across the province that actually finds solutions that work for you. Only by working together will we have the success and prosperity for many years to come. Vote for me, and I will make Albertans the happiest, the healthiest, the most free and most prosperous people in Canada and the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jean. Mr. Travis Toews.
All right, good. Well, thank you to the Western Standard, Derek, to you and your team for hosting. Thank you all for your engagement. Engagement matters right now. A bit about myself. I'm a CPA, I'm a cattle rancher, I'm a business manager and owner, and I'm a typical conservative. My best day was the day I didn't notice government, whether that was in our businesses or in raising our family. I'm also a father of 3 and a grandfather of 11. Friends, I was not engaged in politics until 2015, when our province made a sharp left turn and we elected an NDP government. All of a sudden, I sat up and took note. I was concerned that freedom, the prosperity, the opportunity that we'd been afforded may not be there for the next generation. I ran in the election in 2019, was tapped to be Minister of Finance, and we made great progress. We took a flatlined economy to an economy that's going to lead the nation this year and next. We took a fiscal train wreck to a balanced budget through all 3 years of the fiscal plan. But friends, there's lots more to do. There are many challenges for us here in the province of Alberta. Tonight, right now, I want to draw us to what I believe is the most important question. Which leader can unite this movement, and which leader can be victorious, beat Rachel Notley in the spring of 23? Friends, leadership matters, and I want to commend my counterparts for their commitment to the Conservative movement, to their commitment to the province. But friends, we all have a track record, a leadership track record. We all have exercised management decisions and judgment in the past. We need to evaluate which leader can be trusted to bring good management and good judgment to this province and be victorious in 23. I believe this province needs strong, principled, proven leadership. Friends, that's what I can deliver. Go to tasteforalberta.ca. Thank you.
Thank you. I suppose I've already gone over my own time. I won't repeat the entire question, but, pardon? Oh my God. I'm just eager to ask you this question. Mrs. Danielle Smith.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you to the Western Standard for really providing a true independent voice in the media. I must tell you, everybody had a line during the COVID lockdowns, and my line when I was in mainstream media was when they asked me to bring my coverage in alignment with the narrative. And so when I left the mainstream media, Derek was kind enough to give me a platform on Western Standard so I could interview all the people I wasn't allowed to interview when I was on mainstream media. And that's really a testament to how important it is, the work that you do. We're in the middle, I think, of a crisis in cancel culture. We're in the middle of a crisis where people are worried that they might say one word that will get them canceled or destroy their reputation forever. And I think that the work that you're doing puts us on the front line in Alberta of being that voice for freedom and liberty. Let me tell you why I'm running. I think part of the reason why we're here, the reason we're having a race, is because, quite frankly, the senior leadership in the last government under our premier wasn't listening to the grassroots. I think lockdowns were really harmful for all of us. It hurt us all in our own way. And then with these supply chain disruptions that happened from the constant open close has created an inflation crisis and created some chaos in the business community that we still haven't resolved. And then, of course, on top of that, we have the economic sanctions being imposed on us by Ottawa. And I think one of the things that I hear from members is, what did we do when we got the mandate from the people to stand up to Ottawa in the Equalization referendum? And here's what I think we have to talk about tonight. Who is going to be the best person to stand up to Ottawa? Who will be the best person to defeat Rachel Notley, and who will be the best person to restore our freedoms. And I think that person is me.
Thank you. All right. I know you're all very eager for your candidates, but try to keep applause short, please. All right. Now it's time for the question.
And do I?
The Alberta Sovereignty Act.
Do I get 1 minute? One minute?
Yeah, 1 minute. Candidates have 1 minute to answer, and then each of the other two candidates will have a 1 minute rebuttal. The Sovereignty Act has been extremely controversial. It's been a major topic in the campaign, but your critics have said that it undermines the rule of law and investor confidence. How would you ensure that the Sovereignty Act does not undermine the rule of law and investor confidence in Alberta?
I think we have to realize that Ottawa has created economic chaos. The reason why we have had about $150 billion worth of projects canceled, including Energy East, the Tech Frontier Mine, even Keystone XL, is because these businesses couldn't see a way through to the finish line on getting approvals because of the chaos Ottawa has created in interfering in our jurisdiction. We have constitutional rights to develop our resources in our own way. And Ottawa keeps on creeping and creeping and creeping into our jurisdiction. So all the Sovereignty Act would do is it would put them on notice that we're drawing a line, that we are not going to enforce any federal rules, laws, or regulations that violate the Constitution and our sovereign rights under sections 92 through 95 in the Constitution, or violate the rights of our citizens under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's letting them know that we are going to stop being a junior player in Confederation, and we're going to start being a senior partner. We're putting them on notice.
Thank you. Mr. Toews.
So the Sovereignty Act, if implemented, I believe would create uncertainty and a lack of predictability. It would have the potential to create chaos within this province and send billions of dollars of capital out of Alberta. Look, yes, the federal government has undermined Alberta's vital economic interests, but why should we create additional chaos? All that will do will send our economy into a tailspin. We've made great progress in the last 3 years. We will lead the nation in economic growth this year and next. We cannot see those gains unwound. We have to ensure that we take a strategic approach. Strategic, we win. With chaos, we will lose.
I'll just remind the audience, we've got 20 questions I want to get through tonight, and I'm sure you all do too. Please refrain from heckling. If you want to heckle, become an MLA. You're here. Let's be friendly. Mr. Brian Jean.
Thanks. I agree with most of the elements of the Free Alberta strategy, at least in principle, but I disagree with the Alberta Sovereignty Act. And you might disagree with me, but I spent 10 years in law and 10 years in federal government with Stephen Harper, and I will tell you that the CRA will definitely freeze and take your money if you stop paying your income taxes. I guarantee you that they will stop you in Toronto and arrest you if you violate the laws. The UCP was founded on the principle of the rule of law and obeying the laws so that we don't have anarchy. If you think uncertainty was brought about and disruption was brought about as a result of COVID, if we send these signals, and they are signals because they're already in the Constitution and the Charter of Rights, these things are already there. We just need to make sure we protect them. We need to make sure that Albertans understand that we are going to stand up for them and not take it. And we've had previous premiers that weren't prepared to take that steps. On day one, I will take that step. I will send notice under Section 46 of the Constitution that is laid out specifically how the province will deal with this.
Thank you. The next question is from Mr. Brian Jean. In 2016, you were the first Alberta political leader to propose a referendum on equalization, coming from the recommendations of the Wild Roses Equalization Fairness Panel. That idea was subsequently taken up by outgoing Premier Jason Kenney, and a referendum was held in October of last year, where Albertans overwhelmingly voted to remove equalization from the Constitution. Following this referendum, the Alberta government, however, was silent, and no demand was made that to Ottawa and the other provinces to open negotiations. You have committed to taking this back up if you become the UCP leader and premier. What would you do differently to see concrete changes to abolish or change equalization that the current premier has not?
Well, the first thing you have to understand is equalization was simply brought about because it's a tool to get the changes we need. We need to open up the Constitution. People, Canadians, Albertans have been too afraid to get any deal at all. We need to go to the negotiating table. And how we do that is exactly what Mr. Fildebrandt has said. I brought forward the equalization study. We had an equalization referendum. We got 62% of a mandate from the people of Alberta to go to Ottawa and to send a legal notice, which I will send on day one as Premier. That legal notice will be under Section 46 of the Constitution and under paragraph 69 of the reference case by the Supreme Court in relation to the yes-no vote in Quebec. There's already a path forward that we need to pursue. We need to open up the Constitution to deal with the Senate, to deal with the fact that one vote does not mean one vote in Canada. We don't have equal representation. We cannot get our products to Tidewater. All of these things can be solved, but there's so many others that we can't accomplish. But we need to open the Constitution, and even Ms. Smith agreed with me last night that we need to open the Constitution. Thank you.
Ms. Smith.
Eventually, we need to open the Constitution. It's quite clear. One of the things we have to do on equalization, though, is that we have to be aggressive on this. It's not a matter of tinkering with the formula. Quebec should never be receiving equalization transfers from small provinces like Saskatchewan. How that ever happened is beyond me. And so we need to put forward a position paper that would put forward ideas for how we would eliminate equalization in alignment with what Albertans have told us. Number one, Quebec's hydroelectric power has to be marked up to market. That would eliminate the lion's share of the amount going to Quebec. We also have to adjust for cost of living in the different parts of the country because it doesn't cost as much to deliver services. And we also have to make sure that it doesn't grow with the growth in the economy. If we're going to see a decrease in the disparity between provinces, we shouldn't be increasing equalization. That would eliminate the lion's share of equalization and make sure that Alberta is treated fairly.
Mr. Toews, you were at the cabinet table when the equalization referendum was passed, but not much from the government seems to have been done to act upon the results of it. You say you will take up the cause of equalization reform or of abolition if you are elected UCP leader or premier. What would you do differently from the current premier to see changes to equalization?
I will make sure we're prepared in 2024 when we have an opportunity to renegotiate equalization. I will get support from other like-minded provinces to fix the inconsistency in Quebec hydro treatment versus Alberta non-renewable resource revenue. I will work to eliminate the GDP growth accelerator, which distorts the equalization program. Those changes, along with the cost of living adjustment, takes a $22 billion program down to 11. We have to approach this strategically. We have to take a page out of Quebec's playbook. Every time a Liberal government is in Ottawa, Quebec leverages their political power. What did we do when we had a Harper government in Ottawa? What change did we make to our federal fiscal transfer programs? Friend, we have to be strategic. We have to ensure that we make the changes we can in 24 and finish it off when we have a Conservative government in Ottawa.
Mr. Toews, in 2020, the Fair Deal panel reported back recommending an Alberta police force, an Alberta pension, an Alberta chief firearms officer, and pressing forward with the equalization referendum and recommended status quo in the Constitution. When the report was released, however, Premier Jason Kenney said failure to secure a fair deal is not an option. But more than 2 years later, the only concrete implementation of the Fair Deal panel has been to appoint an Alberta chief firearms officer. Why has so little of the Fair Deal panel's recommendations been implemented? And what would you do with the points that have not yet been implemented?
So you've heard my plan on equalization. We need fundamental reform. We need to take every opportunity to make the changes that are required. Secondly, on an Alberta pension plan, look, friends, an Alberta pension plan is the biggest lever we have in this province to right the fiscal imbalance within Confederation. We've done the econometric work. We've done the actuarial work. I know what great promise it holds. We've also done the constitutional legal analysis. I also know the federal government can throw a wrench into the gears. We have to handle that one tactically. We have to handle it strategically in tactic, methodology, and timing, or we will lose it. We will move forward. If I serve as Premier, I will move forward with that at the time when we can win with an Alberta pension plan. Because if we don't win, political bluster and rhetoric mean nothing.
Mr. Jean.
Section 46, and I quote, may be initiated either by the Senate or the House of Commons or by the Legislative Assembly of a province. A resolution by any of these legislative bodies is the constitutional initiating mechanism, and thus what triggers the duty to negotiate. Paragraph 69 of the Quebec succession reference. The Supreme Court of Canada said, and I quote, Constitution confers a right to initiate constitutional change on each participant in Confederation. The existence of this right imposes a corresponding duty on the participants in Confederation to engage in constitutional discussions in order to acknowledge and address democratic expressions of a desire for change in other provinces. End quote. The people of Quebec have the path forward, which was given to them by the Supreme Court of Canada. I'm suggesting I'll do it on day one. We don't need a Sovereignty Act. We need Brian Jean as Premier, and I will get the job done to get a fair deal from Ottawa. All of this is contingent on that.
Thank you, Mr. Jean. Ms. Smith.
I was in High River during the High River gun grab, and I can tell you, trying to hold the RCMP to account for who was responsible after that was nearly impossible. And now we have an RCMP commissioner who is running interference for the federal government to try to get the make and model of the firearms used in the Nova Scotia shooting so she could use that as a pretext to bring in a new firearms confiscation for 1,500 firearms. This is the reason why in the fall we need to act on bringing forward an Alberta Provincial Police, because when we say we are not going to enforce federal laws that violate our provincial jurisdiction, property and civil rights are our jurisdiction, and we will not enforce that. We will also make sure that we repatriate all of the Firearms Act licensing. I've talked with Terry Bryant, who is the firearms officer. She said we can take over all of the licensing. Most important thing is to implement an income tax, get the ball rolling so that we can start collecting our own income tax, just like Quebec.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith.
Quebec does not collect their own income tax. They don't.
I'm sorry. I'm going to allow specific rebuttals if someone names another candidate or strongly implies something after them. But there's no interjections of that kind, please. The next section.
Smith.
Pardon?
I imply Danielle Smith. Can I now? Quebec does not collect their own federal income taxes. They do not. They have two tax returns. Do you want to do two tax returns?
Mr. Jean. The next section is Alberta Free. The first question is for Mr. Travis Toews. Mr. Toews, you sat in the inner circle of the Kenney government's cabinet since the UCP won in 2019. This government and governments around the world were faced with the unexpected COVID-19 pandemic. During that time, the cabinet imposed many on-again, off-again lockdowns, on-again, off-again mandatory masking orders, and a vaccine passport that the Premier and then Finance Minister promised just weeks before would never see the light of day in Alberta. Churches were raided by police, pastors arrested and thrown in jail, and small business owners shut down for staying open. One teenager in Calgary was attacked by police for playing hockey on an outdoor pond in defiance of provincial restrictions. For many freedom-oriented Albertans, these measures were an overreacting, unscientific, and authoritarian violation of their liberties. What was your role in the government's COVID policies, and what would you have done differently if you had been the Premier at the time?
Yeah, I was the finance minister, not the health minister, but I certainly served on that COVID committee. Look, those were the hardest hours and days of my life. I'm a rancher from rural Alberta. My faith is incredibly important to me. And believe me, those were the hardest days. I believe that my presence around that table made a difference. My perspective, bringing the perspective of rural Albertans, bringing the perspective that I hold dear, the deep commitment and foundational principle of individual freedom, liberty, and limited government, bringing that perspective to the table made a difference. And I believed I best served Albertans and my constituents by staying around the table. One thing I can say, going forward. Lockdowns are not the answer, full stop. Mandating vaccines are not the answer, full stop. You have my commitment on that.
Mr. Jean, you recommended that future lockdowns and mandates should require a vote in the legislature, which they currently do not, rather than just the cabinet. But in March of this year, you said that NDP leader Rachel Notley, I quote, should be brought into the cabinet table and that she should have been brought into decision making. Do you still believe that that would have led to better outcomes during COVID? And what would you have done differently than the current premier?
Well, first of all, I never would have put Rachel Notley in charge of anything. Let's be clear. She would not have been making any decisions. But what I did recognize clearly was that I have seen politics kill people. And in COVID, it did. Decisions were made, we know, by the federal government that did not follow the experts. We've heard the expert testimony saying that. So we know politics played a role. I would never jail pastors. I would never allow that to happen. I would never shut down or lock down people in that way. But what I did suggest, when the fire happened in Fort McMurray, I saw it firsthand how you can take politics out of emergency situations. What happened is Rachel Notley brought me in and my team into all of the information in relation to the fire and my citizens because I was busy serving my citizens in the fire. She made sure that I was privy to everything and my team was privy to everything so that I couldn't play politics because it was too important that people's lives were at risk and their property was at risk, just like COVID. I suggested to bring her in, not to the decision making, but so she could see and hear the information and not play politics and cost our lives. Makes sense.
Ms. Smith, you promised to ban lockdowns outright and make discrimination for healthcare choices such as vaccines illegal under the Alberta Human Rights Act. But some of your critics have said that these proposals are extreme and would endanger public health in future public health emergencies. How would you respond to that?
I would say that sometimes experts are wrong, and it requires political discernment to know when you're getting bad advice, like when health experts tell you to shut down businesses and institute vaccine mandates and demonize unvaccinated people and jail pastors. At some point, you have to stand up as a politician and say no. Todd Lowen stood up. He paid a big price. He got kicked out of caucus for standing up. And I stood up. Look, I don't blame the government for the first couple of months in March, April, when no one knew what was going on. I think everyone was trying to figure it out. We were also told that Alberta Health Services needed the time to increase surge capacity. We were told that they were going to work on increasing ICU beds by 1,089. It was very specific. And then what happened when we were open for summer and supposed to be open for good, we found out that the health experts not only didn't increase ICU capacity, they decreased it to 173. That is the reason why we ended up in the crisis today. Politicians needed to act to override their officials.
Thank you. Mr. Jean, the federal government has passed a host of bills aimed at online speech and media control. This began with a $600 million media bailout, followed by a raft of legislation that would prioritize federally approved media in social media feeds, brings content creators under the CRTC and limit what people can say online, and have Ottawa decide what news is legitimate and which is classified as illegal misinformation. While the bailout and this legislation is all federal, it has a direct impact on the free speech and free press of Albertans. What would you do as Premier to protect freedom of speech and freedom of press from federal actions?
Thank you for that question. I think the universities in Alberta should be free thought generational machines. They should give our students, our kids, the opportunity to stretch their minds as much as possible. And we need to make sure our universities, which are under our exclusive jurisdiction under the Constitution, we have the opportunity to make those the freedom expression areas for Albertans. I would make sure that, first of all, they didn't come into our provincial jurisdiction. Under Section 92, it's federal jurisdiction. Under Section 92, we have the details, folks. We have the rules. We just have to enforce those rules and have a premier that's prepared to do so. That's why I did the equalization referendum study. That's why Jason Kenney had it put in the municipal government for an election and a vote, because we know that we need to take the next step. And the next step is opening the Constitution and talking about all those things that we need to talk about, whether it's the balance of power, whether it's elected Senate, whether it's getting our products to Tidewater, whether it's the continual interference by the federal government. But spending 10 years there, I can tell you, I was disgusted and I want the change. Thank you.
Ms. Smith, what would you do as Premier to protect freedom of speech and freedom of the press from federal action?
From what I've seen, the federal government is trying to regulate our internet media companies like Western Standard and Rebel and True North on the right-hand side of the spectrum, and Tyee, Canada Lands, and The Observer on the left-hand side of the spectrum. So this is hitting both of those types of media outlets equally. What happens with the CRTC is you have to go and defend your license for broadcasting every 5 years. And if you have too many complaints against you, they can hold life or death decision over pulling your broadcast license. That's the reason why mainstream media is not giving the full and robust debate that we now see in the alternative media. And I think they wanted to come in and do the exact same thing here. What I would say is we should make Alberta a free media and free speech zone. If it means that we have to work with Elon Musk and his Starlink satellite service so that we can have free media here, broadcasting to the rest of the country, we should do it. And I'm not saying that idly. I've talked to somebody who's broadcasting into the Ontario market from Florida because they believe this is going to happen, but it shouldn't be happening here.
Mr. Toews.
Free speech is a fundamental right in a free and democratic society. It's critical to defend it. Without it, we have nothing. You know, we have to work with other like-minded provinces to push back on the federal government on so many issues, including this issue of free speech. I'm going to go to our universities, our post-secondary institutions, because that's a place where so often free speech is not allowed. I believe the Alberta government has an opportunity through our funding model to ensure that every university and every college, every post-secondary institution in this province allows and offers free speech right across the political and ideological spectrum. That's absolutely critical to ensure that the next generation is not brainwashed to the activist left. If we go there as the next generation, our society will fail. We have to defend free speech.
Ms. Smith, in 2020, the federal government banned 1,500 different firearms. Some of these were regular hunting rifles and sporting rifles that sometimes had carbonite stocks on them that made them look scary. Also on the list were items that I had assumed were illegal, like German Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets and Russian anti-aircraft missiles. I suppose I missed out while I could. More recently, the federal government has promised to ban the sale, gifting, or transfer of all handguns in Canada. What would you do as Premier to defend the right of firearms owners from the federal government?
Yeah, I began by talking about this and the role that we can play with our chief firearms officer. One of the things that she mentioned is that we already do the regulation on our shops that sell guns. And we also do sort of the higher order of gun licensing for those who need to have a second check. But most of our routine firearms licenses, they get processed in Miramichi. And it's taking not just months, it's taking years to do. I think the federal government is trying to encourage people not to get firearms. If we repatriate that act and we end up doing all of the administration here, it gives us more control over making sure that people who are law-abiding get their firearms. And then when we have an Alberta Provincial Police and the federal government says that they're going to start confiscating firearms, we can say, actually, we have different policing priorities. Our policing priorities is to make sure that those who live in rural communities do not have people going onto their property and stealing their stuff without it being taken care of. That's what our policing priorities should be, but we can only do that if we take control.
Mr. Toews, while you served in cabinet, your government was the first in Canada to appoint its own chief firearms officer. What further steps would you take as Premier to defend the right of firearms owners if you are Premier?
Yeah, number one, we need to work with other like-minded provinces to push back on egregious federal laws and restrictions that limit the freedom of law-abiding gun owners right across the country. Look, we did appoint a CFO, and I was at a gun range here in Calgary a few months ago, and you know that owner brought out automatics that day. We shot automatics in a gun range. I said, "How can you do that?" He said, "You know what? Alberta, with our own CFO, grants us exemptions to do this legally." We benefited. I benefited that day from additional freedom for firearms owners. I would absolutely repatriate the licensing function, the transfer function, that administrative function needs to be conducted here in Alberta. We can do it. It's within our purview, and we will then create and set a course for firearms owners in Alberta to transfer, buy, and sell guns legally and more expeditiously.
Mr. Jean.
I've had a restricted license for 35 years. I'm an avid hunter. I know that firearms are extremely important, and so is safety. And the balance, of course, is Section 91 and 92. I keep coming back to it because in order to do what we want, we have to open up the Constitution. Section 91, of course, deals with safety of the public. Section 92, of course, deals with personal property. What we need to do is pass a personal property law that deals with this particular item, ownership, in order to get the Supreme Court to make a decision on it. If we don't do that, if we don't open the Constitution, we're going to keep coming back to the same thing over and over and over again. In fact, what I would say to you right now is this, is that we can do that and we can pass it and we can get the Supreme Court of Canada to decide where safety is and where personal property is. But more than that, during that process, we have to make sure that the Chief Firearms Officer slows everything down. And I don't usually suggest that's the way to do it, but you know, Mr. Toews is right. We need to slow it down, take over the administrative process, and just stop the federal government coming in. Thank you.
Our next section is Unity and Democracy. Mr. Jean, Voltaire once said that the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. I'd argue that at times the United Conservative Party is neither united nor a conservative nor a party. Over the last 2+ years, the UCP has been hugely disunited. It has taken actions that many would argue are not particularly conservative, and at the best of times resembles more of a coalition than a traditional party. As the leader of the Wild Rose from 2015 to 2017, you led one of the two legacy parties that formed the UCP. How would you as leader be able to make the United Conservative Party united again?
Well, first of all, let's face it. I was the one that pulled us back from the brink after we had a floor crossing for our cabinet seat. Listen, folks, but more than that, team is important. But remember that during that period of time, I had Derek Filderbrand and Drew Barnes in my caucus. We never kicked anybody out. We never had anybody quit. Now, we did suspend somebody, if we remember properly, for about a month. But caucus made that decision. Caucus brought him back in, too. Now, if I can do that with Derek and Drew, I think I can do it with anybody that's there now, right now, for sure. And I think Derek would agree with me. But how you promote unity is by how you treat people. By doing things the right way, making sure you consult properly, making sure that when you're making major decisions to walk across the floor, you don't do it in the closet of darkness, that you bring it out to the people, that you make it available for them like we did in the unifying parties coming together. We had a vote, we were transparent, and we brought the process along, and guess what? Nobody quit any of those caucuses. How about that? That's called unity. Thank you.
Thank you.
I know there's a lack of trust of politicians, and I'm part of the reason for that, because the decision I made in 2014. I'd been involved with the Progressive Conservatives since 1992, and Jim Prentice was the very first campaign manager I worked under, so I had a lot of admiration for him, but I let my own admiration of him get in the way of the job people wanted me to do. I was prepared to go for unity faster, obviously, than the public was. I got punished. I lost my nomination. He got punished. He lost the election. But whatever would have happened in 2015, I think we now know that we are stronger united. That's part of the reason why I came back into this process. I began to see the same divisions forming that had formed back at that time, with rural Alberta feeling disaffected. And we know when rural Alberta feels disaffected, they end up forming their own party. I've been inviting everybody to come back in by promising them that we wouldn't have lockdowns, by promising that we would finally do something on autonomy this time. And that's the reason why I'm here. I'm here to fight for you.
Mr. Toews.
You know, number one for unity around the caucus table is to ensure that every government MLA has a voice. Absolutely critical. It's fundamentally important, and I would ensure that occurs. But, you know, I talked about the importance of good judgment in providing leadership. I got involved in politics because this province elected an NDP government. And I want to point to Danielle Smith right now, because the floor crossing in 2014, I believe, led not only to the end of her immediate political career and that of Jim Prentice, but it led to a setback for this province and for all Albertans in decades, in tens of billions of dollars. Friends, that's not leadership. That is not good judgment. That does not unify a movement.
I will allow a rebuttal if you'd like, Ms. Smith.
Look, guys, no politician is perfect, but I think we all respect politicians who recognize mistakes, who own up to them, and who apologize. In fact, I think that's part of the reason we're in the problem that we're in right now, is that we've had precious little apologizing for a lot of the errors that have been made in the last 2 years. Now, I have humbly apologized to you for my role in splitting the Conservative movement. I'd ask Mr. Toews to apologize to you for the role he played in locking us down the last 2 years.
I'm going to allow a rebuttal to Mr. Toews, although I'm going to try to make sure this doesn't become a volleyball game at this point here. Mr. Toews.
Oh, absolutely. You know, as I travel around this province, I absolutely acknowledge that so many of the government decisions were taken in error in the last 2 years. I acknowledge all the loss that Albertans have experienced. And I apologize as part of that COVID cabinet committee, even though I brought a perspective of freedom. I was part of that decision making. I was part of that government, and I'm happy to own that. But here's the reality. When Danielle crossed the floor in 2014, it ultimately took this province to the left. That resulted in an NDP government for our children and grandchildren. That set this province back decades. That's what brought me into politics today. That's what we have to avoid.
All right. Well, I can't control the motorcycle, but I appreciate everyone's passion, but I want to keep this moving along. I'm having a lot of fun. But let's try to keep it tame and not heckle each other too much. We're going to talk about nominations. Ms. Smith, party nominations are a quiet yet critical part of modern democracy. In so-called safe seats, the nomination of a candidate determines who the MLA is much more than the general election. Every party has controversies and nominations, but the UCP has had several highly questionable disqualifications that resulted in protecting certain incumbent MLAs and ministers fairly recently. If you are party leader, will you reopen nominations in constituencies where candidates were disqualified on questionable grounds?
I've told the party executive that I recognize this is a joint responsibility for us to ensure fair nominations. And so I'll kind of reserve judgment until October the 7th. If I win, I'd like to have that conversation with them, because there may be some things behind the scenes that I don't know. But what I would say is that our party allows for the leader to appoint in four ridings. And I think if the leader wanted to protect a couple of candidates, they should have just been forthright about that and done the appointment, said that these two individuals were House Leader and Deputy House Leader were necessary for the legislative agenda. I think that was probably the reason, because we can't go around destroying people's reputations unnecessarily. We have a fiduciary responsibility as well. And if we start doing cancel culture the same way that the left does cancel culture, we are not going to get good people to run for us. So I think we have to look at some of the rules around disqualification and maybe be a little bit more forgiving about what somebody might have put on their Facebook page 12 years ago.
Thank you. Mr. Jean, would you reopen nominations in constituencies that have had some questionable disqualifications?
Yes, I would, because we're trying to unify a party here. And the only way we're going to unify a party is to be transparent, to be accountable, to make sure the grassroots, the CAs, the members, all of Albertans see that we are unified. That is the only way we can do this, and we need to open it up and show the transparency and the fact that the members are in charge of our party, because as soon as you lose the membership, you have another party. You have disunity, and you have a crisis in Alberta. And you know what? The number one thing I'm here for, I had great hopes for Jason Kenney, but the number one thing I'm here for is to make sure the NDP don't win an overwhelming majority ever again in Alberta, and I hope you're with me.
The same question to you, Mr. Toews. Would you reopen nominations, whether the questionable disqualifications?
So I would absolutely ask the board to take a look at that. I would want to see that the criterion that was used is defensible and fair. Ultimately, members elected our party board. And it was the party board who made those decisions. So to respect grassroots members, I would say we shouldn't categorically overturn their decision. But I would want to see that criterion and make sure that it was done in a spirit of fairness. Now, look, I recognize that when you step up to public office, we are under public scrutiny, and anything in my past can affect the electability of the movement. We have to recognize that. And so a screening and vetting process is important. I know when I went through mine, it felt like I needed a hot shower when we were done. That's the reality. It's invasive, and it has to happen. I support the process. I would also support a review of the criterion that was used by the board.
Mr. Toews, last year, MLAs Todd Loewen and Drew Barnes were expelled from the United Conservative Party caucus after the first called on Premier Jason Kenney to resign, and the later for, well, being Drew. I won't ask you how anyone else voted since it was a caucus meeting, although I may have been there in spirit. But you did have a secret ballot that you are at liberty to speak about. The reason for their expulsion, conflict with the current premier, seems to be a moot point now. Would you tell us how you voted on their expulsion, and would you support their return to the United Conservative Party caucus?
I would certainly support Drew and Todd returning to the United Conservative Party caucus. I believe right now we have an opportunity to push the reset button on this conservative movement. Unity is absolutely essential. In fact, friends, if we fail to unite, we will hand this province over to the NDP. And there's not one person in here who wants to see that. I would absolutely ensure that both Todd and Drew could come back into the party. We would push the reset button, and we would have a fresh start.
It was a two-part question. You can decline to answer, but I want to put it to you again. Would you tell us how you voted on the expulsion of Mr. Barnes and Mr. Loewen? You can decline to answer if you wish.
Sure. Well, you know what? I'm going to answer it this way. I believe that every MLA needs full opportunity to express their views and the views of their constituents at the caucus table. I also believe after decisions are taken, that caucus speaks with one voice, regardless of the personal viewpoints we bring. That's my position. And that was informed by the time when I was president of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association.
Okay. I'll take that as a decline if you don't. That's okay. Ms. Smith, you were not a member of the UCP caucus during the expulsion vote. But if you become UCP leader and premier, would you support the return of Mr. Barnes and Mr. Loewen?
I understand that the vote was taken in caucus, and I think a vote of caucus should take place for them to return. I've talked to our caucus colleagues, and my understanding is they would vote in favor of that. They haven't had a caucus meeting, which I think is fundamentally what's at the heart of the problem of why it is we have caucus disunity, is that they don't have a fair process and a full process to get to know each other, to get to like each other, to feel like their voices are being heard. And I guess I disagree. In the culture in our party in the Wild Rose was that we believed in free votes. We believed that we tried to get to a consensus, but in the end, if a person has a reason of conscience for why it is they can't go along and why it is they feel they have to vote for their constituents' views, that's what should prevail, because they represent you, the elected, as elected representatives. They don't work for the party leader, and the leader has to make sure they do everything to try to bring that consensus together. But in the end, it does have to. We do have to have caucus freedom.
Ms. Smith, I'm going to just rephrase it again, just point blank.
Yeah.
Would you support?
Yes.
You would support their return?
Yes, 100%.
Mr. Jean, you are a member of the caucus now, but you were not at the time of their expulsion vote. If you are leader and premier, would you support the return of Mr. Barnes and Mr. Loewen?
I would, absolutely I would. I've been clear on that. I'd actually have all the candidates here, including Todd as a member of cabinet, because I think it's important if you're going to put yourself up here that you should be part of the team, leading the team later on. But, you know, I have a track record of leading businesses and organizations, almost 15 years of elected experience both federally and provincially. And I will tell you folks that you can't unite people, you can't bring them together, and you will not avoid having another party if you don't listen to them and respect them. And we need to make sure the caucus has the vote, the caucus has the ability to bring them back in. And, you know, if caucus listens to them and we understand what the ramifications of not bringing them in is, which means another party on the right and the NDP, in my opinion, getting elected, then I think they will come back in. But we have to have a clear conversation, and that's up to caucus to do that. But I'm not so sure they will let those two people back in. And we need to make sure, as the people of Alberta, that we make caucus understand, along with myself and everybody up here, that that's what we need to do. We need to unite.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next segment is Please God Give Us One More Oil Boom. I promise not to piss it all away this time. Mr. Toews, for the first time since Ralph Klein was Premier, Alberta is in a significant fiscal surplus position, but much of this is driven by high non-renewable natural resource prices. Alberta's spending still remains extremely high. In the last year of the NDP government, total spending was $56.3 billion, but in the most recent year that concluded under your management as finance minister, spending was $64.4 billion. That means that this government is spending $8.1 billion more per year than under the highest year of the NDP. As leader and premier, would you consider cutting spending in real terms to less than it was when the party came to office? And what would be your priorities with the budget surplus?
Yeah, Derek, good question. I have to point out, though, that in the previous year, there was approximately $5 billion in COVID spending related to economic recovery. I had my department break out operating expenditures so that department heads couldn't commingle that funding in baseline budgets. We've kept operating expenditures flat for 4 years. That's how we've eliminated the $10 billion differential between Alberta's spending and comparator provinces. That was step one in putting this province on a sustainable fiscal trajectory. With a surplus, I would immediately, any surplus up to the earnings level of the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, I would immediately redeposit in that Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Beyond that, we need to set funds aside to ensure that we can pay off debt as it matures. If we have to go to capital markets and borrow for that debt to pay it off, we'll be doing it at twice the cost of capital. We will not be able to afford that. Fiscal discipline will continue to matter.
Mr. Jean.
Well, right now, folks, nurse overtime is 120% of their salaries. We're spending more money than anywhere else in Canada. I admit that COVID was a blip, but we need to change how we do things. And it doesn't mean we have to cut back on money. It just means we need somebody that knows how to manage things, how to reorganize things, how to get things working again, how to empower people, how to unify them and make a plan work and stick to it. We're spending far too much, and we need to cut it back. But we don't need to cut back the people. We could actually give our nurses a 10% raise, double the amount of nurses, and we'd be spending the same amount of money. Like, seriously, would we have a health problem if we did that? No, we would not. That's why we have to do so many things differently. But we need somebody that understands that and will get past the bluster and all the other situations that happen when you been in government too long and you talk about things you don't know about. Surpluses, I would use the interest on the surplus to alleviate the inflation burden on Albertans right now and pay off the debt as it becomes due, just as Mr. Toews says. That's what we have to do. I would not put savings in the Heritage Fund for now, but I would in time after the debt is paid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Smith.
Some people like to dust off old columns of mine, so let me tell you an oldie but a goodie from 2001 when the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, which Derek worked for, had the idea that we should set aside a certain portion of our surpluses year after year after year in our Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Just go back to the same original idea that Peter Lougheed had. If we had done that, I remember calculating a couple of years ago, we would have had $250 billion in our Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Now, the best time to have started that would have been back in 2001 when I was writing about it. The next best time to do that would be now. If we wait until there's money left over to start a savings plan, there's never money left over. The wealthy barber taught us. So we need to have, once again, a long-term savings plan. Let's set an audacious goal. Let's put it out there that we want to have a sovereign wealth fund that's $500 billion, generating $25 billion a year so we can eliminate income tax and eliminate corporate income tax. And let's tighten our belts now to make that happen.
Ms. Smith, in the last election, the UCP ran on a platform of abolishing the NDP's consumer carbon tax, but quietly left in place the NDP's carbon tax on the oil and gas industry. This carbon tax operates under the name Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Program. The Alberta government even obtained approval from the federal Liberal government for its industrial carbon tax. This energy industry carbon tax has the support of some big producers, but is opposed by most of the small and medium-sized firms. The UCP government took the federal government to court on the consumer carbon tax, but ultimately lost in the Supreme Court of Canada. As UCP leader and premier, would you repeal or maintain Alberta's own industrial carbon tax? And what, if anything, would you do to resume the fight over the federal carbon tax following the defeat in the Supreme Court?
I think that the consumer carbon tax is unfair to Albertans, especially when you look at our accelerating natural gas bills and home heating in the winter. It harms our seniors, our electricity bills, because 90% of our power grid is based on fossil fuels. If you look at the rising cost of gasoline and diesel, I think that Brian's come up with some great ideas about how to bring gasoline and diesel prices down. I know that Travis and others have proposed ways to bring down our electricity prices. So we have to continue the fight on the consumer carbon tax. But I must tell you, the 90% of our oil sands company, 90% of our companies have committed to aggressive emissions targets reduction. And part of the reason is that they are looking at ways in which they can reduce emissions through technology. If we end up increasing our LNG exports by double or triple or quadruple, we can reduce global emissions and get credit for that. If we start counting all of the sequestration that we currently do in our forests and soils and grasslands, I would bet we're already net negative.
Thank you. Thank you. I've got to come back to you for a direct answer. Would you abolish or maintain
I'd
the
maintain
industrial carbon tax?
I'd maintain the tier program, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Mr. Jean, same question to you. Would you maintain or repeal the industrial carbon tax? And what, if anything, would you do to fight the consumer carbon tax following Alberta's defeat in the Supreme Court?
Well, I've mentioned opening up the Constitution because that's the Supreme Court of Canada actually interpreted the current Constitution, and that's why we lost the carbon tax case. Let's open the Constitution. Let's talk about carbon tax again. But would I keep that fund? Well, it depends on whether there's an equivalent in the federal government, because if there's a not, then we have to talk to the federal government because they have the environment file. And if we don't have an equivalent here in Alberta, then they can bring one in that's even worse than the one we have. So I would make sure, first of all, that the federal government would not bring one in. But I always believe in lowering taxes, Derek, every opportunity I have. So if we can get rid of this carbon tax on industry and the industry itself, the corporations, the big corporations want to get rid of it, I think that's a very important thing, but they're the one being taxed on it. And if they think that's a solution, we should work with them to make sure that it is a solution. And if it's not a solution and we can get rid of it, absolutely.
Mr. Toews, I'll put it the same to you. Would you maintain or repeal the UCP's industrial carbon tax? And what, if anything, would you do with the federal consumer carbon tax?
So the federal consumer carbon tax is ridiculous, and we ultimately need a regime change in Ottawa to get that one fixed. We did all we could at the Supreme Court of Canada. I would maintain the tier program, the heavy emitter levy. All of the proceeds of that program are reinvested back in the industry for technology improvements. And to Brian's point, that keeps the feds out of our jurisdiction, which matters. So that's important. What's the problem? Is that the pricing of the carbon is accelerating at rates that are untenable. And if we outpace other economies, competing energy producers on trying to get to net zero, like my leadership hopeful to the left has suggested, we will actually put the energy industry out of business in this province. We can't outpace competing economies and competing energy producers. We have to make sure that price of carbon is not too high, or we simply will not compete.
I'm not sure if the jab was about carbon tax or saying that she was to your left, but I will allow a rebuttal.
Well, I think perhaps Travis may misunderstand what is happening already in the space. I mean, if you are exporting LNG, that's actually increasing the ability of us to continue to invest and also generate revenues, and we get offsets. That's how the Paris Accord is working. I'm not sure why we wouldn't take advantage of that. We've also got a huge investment strategy in hydrogen. We've become expert at capturing CO2 and burying it underground. I'm not sure why we would oppose that. Our bitumen, the best use for it is asphalt. And even if you drive an electric car, you're going to need roads to drive them on. So I see an acceleration in our export of asphalt, even if we're not using it for combustion purposes. It may not be well known, but there's 6,000 different products that come out of a barrel of oil. Only 30% of them are combustion, 70% aren't. The idea that we're going to phase out this industry is ridiculous. It'd be like talking about phasing out steel or phasing out cement. I think we have so much upside, and I'm so excited that the industry is investing in all of these technologies to make it happen.
Mr. Jean, right now gasoline runs about $1.48 in most of Calgary. The UCP government removed the provincial portion of the tax on gasoline, which saw prices fall relative to other provinces that maintain their taxes. At times, however, the Alberta prices have come up to match or even exceed a few other provinces, even though they had lower taxes. But they have come back down again, however. You've said that you believe Alberta drivers are being ripped off. On July 21st, you said that you will, quote, end price gouging and that the abuse must stop. You said, I quote, increasing regulation is not something I would normally consider, but that you would introduce legislation that would allow the government to set retailer margin caps when there is abuse. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney asked the Competition Bureau to look into gasoline price fixing, but none has been found as of yet. Do you still believe that gasoline prices are being fixed in Alberta and that a government-imposed profit cap is the best way to fix that?
Well, I think competition is the best way to fix the market. It always is. But right now, if you want to start a gas station, it's going to cost a lot of money to do so. So it's not really an easy entry market. Are they ripping us off? Well, they did 30 to 35 cents there for about 3 months. They certainly did. The money was being stopped at the retail and the wholesale level, and it was not getting the savings from the Alberta government, was not getting to the Albertans. That's why I proposed a royalty-free gasoline policy that would mean that Albertans don't pay gas on the gas that they actually consume. That'd be about 380,000 barrels a day. And in fact, that would save about 15 cents off each and every liter that Albertans would purchase. Along with the fuel tax savings, that would be another, probably in total, about 28 cents. Now, these things would make everything cheaper. It'd make groceries cheaper. It would obviously make going to work cheaper. It'd make everything else we do less expensive because gas is directly linked to the economy and inflation. And that's why I propose that. And I think regulation, if I can just say this, is not what I would do. But 5 provinces regulate right now. And what I would regulate is enabling regulation, which would enable it to be brought forward immediately.
That's time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Toews, do you believe gasoline prices are being fixed in Alberta? And would a government under your leadership consider making the abolition of the gas tax, provincial gas tax, permanent?
You know, as finance minister, I always stated during times of inflation, the best thing governments can do is spend less, borrow less, and tax less. And I was very, very privileged to bring the fuel tax suspension program into place. I would make that permanent, by the way, if I served Albertans as premier. No, I would not bring in regulation to limit margin. I believe that that's a slippery slope. When governments start to regulate profitability, what we need to do is ensure that there are fewer barriers to entry so that we have a competitive marketplace. Now, price fixing, collusion, that's illegal already. That needs to be investigated. But in the absence of that aberrant behavior, we need to ensure that a very competitive marketplace exists, and that ultimately will result in very efficient, competitive prices to consumers. Bringing regulation in to eliminate profitability is a slippery slope that will undermine investment in this province.
Ms. Smith.
I'll just compliment both Travis and Brian on this, because Travis is right. In fact, by eliminating the fuel tax, we have pretty much eliminated the effect of the carbon tax at the federal level. They're still taking our money, so it's still worth a fight to figure out how we can make that stop. But I think that was a good policy. And to Brian's credit, he was on this issue right from the beginning. He's been watching Dan McTeague, and Dan McTeague pointed out that the wholesale price had really dropped and our prices here hadn't. I think that's what prompted Jason Kenney to look into it, and they responded pretty quickly as soon as the Premier said he was looking into it. So I think that we have a good resource in Dan McTeague. I was very pleased that Brian put forward his policy, because in every oil-rich jurisdiction, they do have a local pricing policy for their consumers. And so if we can figure out a way to make his royalty break permanent, I think that's the idea we should all support.
I have to get you guys fighting again. Okay. Mr. Toews, credit unions are a major part of the financial industry in Alberta, especially in rural communities, focusing on small businesses and agriculture. In many communities, they're the only bank in town. The Credit Union Act is thought by many in the industry to be out of date and tying the hands of Alberta credit unions, putting them at a disadvantage with big federally backed Eastern banks. As finance minister, you oversaw the credit union sector in Alberta, and in your campaign, you've talked about strengthening Alberta's hand against Eastern interests. What would a government under your leadership do to help Alberta-based credit unions compete and innovate against the federally backed Eastern banks?
Well, a couple of things. As finance minister, I brought in a lot of red tape reduction, regulatory modernization to the Credit Union Act. I worked to broaden the powers of the Credit Union Deposit Guarantee Corporation, and I've really moved that. It's called CUDGE in acronym. Moved CUDGE to really position it as a single financial regulator in the future in the province. I believe if we can have a single financial regulator, it will ultimately position the financial services sector for strength in Alberta, and more broadly to compete right across the country. Look, regulatory reform in financial services is absolutely critical. The credit unions provide incredible service to Albertans right across this province. Their powers need to be broadened, but they also need to be unfettered with additional red tape reduction, regulatory modernization as we move forward.
Ms. Smith, what would a government under your leadership do to help strengthen Alberta credit unions vis-a-vis most of the Eastern-based central banks, or federally backed Eastern banks?
I think everybody should get an account at a credit union, because if the federal government comes through with Emergencies Act again and wants to start seizing and freezing bank accounts, we can say, move your money to the credit unions, and because they are under our regulatory jurisdiction, we will not enforce that. I wish we had done that the first time. But I can tell you, I have talked to heads of credit unions, and that money is flowing in to credit unions. The federal government has done a lot to reduce the confidence that we have in the banking system. And I think that was part of the reason why we had the reversal in the policy as quickly as we did. So I think that the credit unions are going to play a very important role in future. I'm looking at ways in which we can use the credit union and maybe have our own insurance on CMHC type of insurance, so that as we get into this period of higher interest rates, we can make sure that those original homeowners don't end up finding themselves in a position where they're upside down on a mortgage. That is going to be the next big crisis that we have to face, is making sure that we have affordable housing.
Thank you. Mr. Jean, you seem to disagree.
I do disagree. I spent 10 years doing foreclosure law for banks. The credit unions have to obey Revenue Canada when they send a notice, and they don't need a judgment. They don't need a lawyer. They just send a notice, and they're going to take your money out of your account, no matter what you do. But listen, folks, the credit union's not the only great tool we have in Alberta to serve Albertans. We have the ATB that was set up in order to make the charter banks that were taking advantage of Albertans to be competitive. What we need to do is have the government force the ATB through a direction, ATB, to get back to business of basic lending, to get back to make sure that Albertans can buy homes at affordable interest rates. Not competitive. They're not there to make money. They're there to serve Albertans. That means small business loans. That means student loans. That means farmers. All of these things should be in a situation where the ATB does not need to make a profit off of Albertans. We own it, just like we own the oil sands, just like we own the natural gas. We own it. We should not be paying a profit on it. We should make sure the ATB, the credit unions, serve Albertans with lots of cash so we can start being profitable again. Thank you.
Ms. Smith, in a September 2020 column in the Calgary Herald, you said that the Alberta government should balance the budget by, I quote, increasing taxes and reducing spending in equal measure. You went on to say that the Alberta government needed to raise $5 billion in new taxes and, quote, yes, a provincial sales tax. During this campaign, you've come under fire for this column. In response, you've said that you're against the PST and that the candidates pointing this out are smearing you. But they are pointing to a column where you were supporting a PST. Did you change your mind about a sales tax, or are we reading your column incorrectly?
When I wrote the column, we were at $24 billion in deficit. It's part of the reason why we have the record high debt in the province. I think it's up to over $100 billion now. We only had $2 billion with the resource revenue at the time. And I think everybody was wondering how we were going to get out of the mess. Our Western Canada Select was trading negative, as was our natural gas. So columns are written at a point in time. Fortunately, we have now gotten to a position where
we're going to give another couple seconds on your answer.
All right.
It's the perils of where
Fortunately, we're now at a position where our fortunes have turned. I mean, we have $16 billion worth of resource revenue. Keep in mind, we only have $4 billion in surplus. It means we are still over-reliant on that $12 billion to fund our operational spending. That's why we need to look at structural reforms. It's why we need to look at putting a dedicated amount set aside for savings so that we can increase a new income stream that comes from savings. And we also need to put in place a dedicated debt reduction plan so that as we pay down debt, we're also freeing up money that can be used for operations. That's the plan we need to follow now.
Thank you. Mr. Toews, about a month and a half after Ms. Smith's column, you told the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce that you would consider a provincial sales tax, but only after we cut spending and COVID-19 was in the rearview mirror. Now that the balanced budget and COVID are behind us, is a PST on the table?
Absolutely not. And what I state is I would appoint a revenue panel to take a deep dive into Alberta's revenue structure to ensure we have the most efficient and appropriate structure possible. I never committed at all to a PST or to one tax increase. I balanced the budget by actually reducing corporate taxes, positioning this economy for growth, which results in expanded fiscal capacity and bringing fiscal discipline to the province. We balanced the budget without a $5 billion tax increase. Friends, my mind hasn't changed on a PST. My mind has never changed on the approach to ensure a province is successful fiscally and economically. The worst thing you can do during an economic challenge is increase taxes. That's something I wouldn't do. It's something I didn't do. We balanced the budget without that, in fact, with tax decreases.
Mr. Jean, Alberta may be back in surplus, but that surplus is highly dependent on volatile, non-renewable natural resources.
Can I answer this question?
This is a part of the same thing. You are part of it. Alberta still faces a structural deficit, however, because this is based on volatile, non-renewable resources. Would a PST ever be on the table under your leadership?
Well, I'm the only candidate that said it, and I'm the last one to say it. I would never bring in a PST in Alberta ever as premier. Let's be clear, no PST ever, notwithstanding we may have a deficit. And I understand, I have an MBA in finance. I've run a lot of businesses. I understand the argument for it, but you know what the argument against is? Vulnerable Albertans will pay the price disproportionately, and they will suffer even more so under a PST than they do right now under inflation. So never a PST, and I would ask my friends here to say the same thing, never a PST. It's several words, it's easy to say. They've not said it. Let's hear it. They told the story, but they didn't say it.
We're actually running slightly ahead, so I want to come back to something you said, Mr. Toews. You said that there's been no tax increases while you were finance minister, but in the first budget of this government, the government reintroduced bracket creep, the de-indexation of income taxes. That was something in particular that the Premier fought against when, we had kind of the same job at one point with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Would you speak to why you believe that was necessary at the time, and what is the future of bracket creep or re-indexing of income taxes in the future with you as Premier?
Thank you, Derek. We inherited a fiscal train wreck, and we had to take a number of decisions, difficult decisions, to ensure that we could bring this province to balance. One of those was simply pausing indexation on a number of programs, including indexation in our personal tax system. At the time, I committed to Albertans, as soon as we had fiscal daylight, as soon as we had brought the province to balance, to fiscal responsibility, I would re-index both the programs and the personal tax system. I've committed to do that and would follow through with that. But really what we did is actually reduce taxes, not raise them. We reduced our corporate tax rate by 4%. That's by 1/3. Very, very significant. Here's the good news, friends. We're going to collect more in corporate tax revenue at an 8% rate than the NDP did at 12%. That shows the benefit of economic growth and expanded fiscal capacity.
I'll allow each of the other two to jump in on the concerning income tax indexation. Mr. Jean.
Well, certainly, I think one thing we've learned right now is that vulnerable Albertans right across the province are suffering because of inflation and lack of the indexing by the government, and making sure we stay to the times is not something I would ever do. I think we need to make sure that we keep pace with inflation, we keep pace year to year with wages, and we have a great opportunity here in front of us. And maybe a lot of people haven't seen it, but there is a reset right now, and not the reset that they're talking about at the WEF. I reject that. But the reset is in wages in Alberta and people's income versus what we're paying out. Inflation is killing us. We need to bring people's wages up. We need to bring the public service up, but we can do it without spending more money. As I mentioned, right now, nurses are 120% of what they get is in overtime. We just need to do things smarter. We need somebody to reorganize it and fix it and make sure it is directed in the right path. And that's me. Thank you.
Ms. Smith?
Bracket creep was something that I think, again, Canadian Taxpayers Federation ended years ago, and something we were really proud of doing. And I think we have to have it return, especially for the low income programs for AISH and Seniors Benefit and others. It has to come back. Look, as I told you what my plan would be for increasing revenues, it's got to be on something that is sustainable, saving our money so that we can put it aside so that we can earn income and investment income. And I think we have to remember that Ralph Klein protected citizens by making sure that no one could bring in a sales tax without it going to a vote of the people. So if there was ever a sales tax that was brought in, it would be because you wanted it. And I'm not hearing any calls for an increase in taxes, especially in the situation we find ourselves in now. But I am hearing that we've got to make sure we get off this revenue roller coaster, that we've done a good job of getting to this point. And I commend the government on the corporate income tax reduction. It's clearly worked, but we still are over reliant on those resource revenues. And we've got to work on making sure that we wean ourselves off that reliance.
Our next segment is not nearly so interestingly named. It's about social programs. Brian, Mr. Jean, healthcare has been an area you've spoke about a lot since you entered provincial politics in 2015. But healthcare in every Canadian province is broken, not just Alberta. We all spend more than almost anywhere else on the planet, and we all have lower than average measurables in healthcare outcomes than most OECD countries, many of which are poorer. Nobody in Canada has run for office in the last 60 years and not promised to fix healthcare, but still no one's done it. One key reason might be that all of the reforms taken are all within the restraints of the Canada Health Act, which prohibits individuals from obtaining private insurance for most primary health care. Would you be willing to go outside of Ottawa's Health Care Act in any of your health reforms as Premier?
I would be prepared to. I certainly would, because healthcare is 42% of our budget and there's nothing more important than getting it right, but we don't need to. What we need to do is fix the system we have. Listen, folks, I lost my son to healthcare. It was negligence, but there's no accountability. The person that did the system on them does not even know to this day that what they did killed him. 2 doctors reordered the test. 2 doctors then canceled that same test. $1,000 test, he was costing $10,000 a day in the hospital. I'm passionate about it. How am I going to fix it? Doesn't need to go against Canada. We can emulate Germany. They have a great stay-at-home model that saves 90% and keeps seniors at home. That's where they want to be. We could look at immediately, and I want to do this, bring back nurse practitioners. There's 700 of them right now ready to go, but we haven't given them the legislative opportunity. Let's bring more nurses in. Let's get rid of the gatekeepers that are controlling how much our doctors and nurses can do, and stop underutilizing our equipment.
Thank you.
We paid for it. We should be using it 24 hours a day.
Mr. Toews, would you as Premier be willing to go outside of the Canada Health Act in any reforms?
You know, our healthcare system is broken not only here in the province, but right across the country. And we're going to have to be courageous enough to look at other healthcare systems. We're going to have to look at systems in Europe. We're going to have to look at systems Switzerland, Germany, and others. And we need to operate from a point of fiscal strength, because it's going to be up to Alberta to lead in healthcare reform. Our system is not sustainable. I believe in universal public health care. I believe that every Canadian, every Albertan should have access to our healthcare system, but our current system needs deep reform. And so I can't commit to never contravening the lines of that very restrictive Canada Healthcare Act. And that's why down the road in the future, we need to operate from a position of fiscal strength. So as we lead on healthcare reform in this nation, we're able to do it boldly.
Ms. Smith, is the Canada Health Act a sacred cow to you, or would you be willing to go outside it?
All the changes that we can make within the umbrella of the Canada Health Act. The main thing that we have to do is we have to get back to decentralized decision making. Ross Sherman wasn't allowed in our race, but you know why he got kicked out of the PC party? He didn't want the health super board. He said it was a big mistake, that we couldn't get rid of local oversight and community care. So let's go back to having local hospital boards, but most importantly, we need to get Alberta Health Quality Council to go into a facility audit of every single hospital in Alberta, and we've got about 106 of them. Because what we're hearing is that we have operating rooms that aren't in operation. There's one up in High Prairie where the 2 operating rooms in a brand new hospital have never been brought into commission. We've got 60% of our long-term care residents are waiting for a long-term care placement in acute care beds. That's one of the reasons why we don't have a flow in our hospitals. And we also have to look at I'm out of time. But ambulance, I'll get back to ambulance.
All right. Ms. Smith, Mr. Toews. Replacing the NDP's K-12 curriculum has been met with fierce opposition from the main teachers union, the ATA, and not unexpectedly, the NDP. The process itself has been gummed up with school boards refusing to pilot it and at least one candidate of the UCP opposing it. Do you believe that your government got the curriculum wrong?
You know, I believe the direction that we've set in curriculum reform is absolutely essential. I believe that to focus on the core competencies, core disciplines of numeracy, literacy, fact-based education will ensure that the next generation is well prepared for further education or to pursue a career. I also deeply believe that parents are fundamentally responsible for their children's education, and that has to be affirmed. You know, I was in favor, as supported Minister LaGrange, in pausing the social studies curriculum to ensure that, you know, the sequencing and timing, that age appropriateness of the material was correct. We need to pause to get it right. But one thing we have to do is take all the activist ideology out of the curriculum. It simply doesn't belong there.
Ms. Smith.
Totally agree. All of the feedback I get from parents comes down to, what are my kids learning in school? Almost every parent has a story where their kids come home and they're saying, that's not consistent with my values, or it's not consistent with, if it's the energy sector, with what the reality is in the energy sector. And I think the teachers have to be held accountable for that. What I want to see is if we can have more parental control and direction at the school level so that parents feel like they have some control over giving that sort of feedback. I think the curriculum, the way they've done the pause, I've been hearing that the literacy and math components of the K-3 education is exactly what we need right now. I'm really worried that our kids have fallen behind in school from the last 2 years. Not everybody can learn well online. We've got mental health issues that we've got to deal with. So I think the pause in the curriculum was a good decision. But now let's test our kids, make sure they're performing at grade level. And if they're not performing at grade level, we got to put the money in now to make sure that we bring them up so that they can read and write and do math and don't end up falling behind.
Mr. Jean, did the government get it wrong on the curriculum?
Yes, they did get it wrong. I will tell you, first of all, as a father of a 3.5-year-old child right now, a little girl, I would not put her in the current public school system because of what's going on. I've raised kids. I have a 38-year-old as well, and I've seen them go through the school system. What I would do immediately, and what I've told the ATA, is that I would slow it down. I would make sure we treat it as a pilot project so that teachers, who are very important to our communities, so teachers can see it over the next year and use it if they want to as they go through it, because it's going to take some time to learn it. Remember, we changed everything all of a sudden, all the core curriculum courses. That's the other thing we need to do. Let's do it one curriculum course a year so that we can see predictable changes to our curriculum over time, and teachers know that. Wouldn't that be a surprise? Parents know that. Wouldn't that be a surprise? They have the opportunity. Parents need to always be in charge of their kids' education. That's why we need to make sure we always have choice in education so parents can find the model that fits for them. Also, mental health has to be a component from grade 6 to 12.
Thank you.
And I want to talk more about that.
Smith, you're known as a libertarian, and, well, it's pretty common for libertarians to support the decriminalization of narcotics, instead focus on treatment and organized crime. Googling around, I came across a Rick Bell column from 2013 titled "Wild Rose Boss Talks Decriminalization," and yes, she smoked once. You said that you supported the decriminalization of cannabis, and it was in fact legalized just a few years later. But decriminalizing cannabis is different than decriminalizing harder drugs. I'm not putting words in your mouth. I'm speaking generally about libertarian suites of issues. The BC government has recently signed an agreement with Ottawa to allow for the effective decriminalization of many drugs, including hardcore narcotics such as crack, heroin, and methamphetamines. Would you as Premier consider a similar arrangement to effectively decriminalize other narcotics in Alberta and refocus efforts towards treatment and organized crime?
You know, I remember that being asked in that interview, I had to call my mom and come clean because I'd never told her that I'd smoked pot once. So I'm glad I can actually admit it now publicly. And part of the reason I supported it is there's a lot of young people who use cannabis recreationally and don't drink, and that's just one of their pastimes. So I had supported a legalization of cannabis, but I don't support it for hard drugs, because once you've gotten addicted to hard drugs, there is a hard path ahead of you for that. And a lot of kids, and I've been involved with the Alberta Adolescent Recovery Center in trying to get some of those kids clean, and not all of them make it. But I would far rather see an approach that once we find somebody who is addicted to hard drugs, that we find a way to give them access to that kind of long-term inpatient care treatment. It takes about 9 months for somebody to get clean from an addiction like that. And then we have to have wraparound services at the end, so when they get out of treatment, they have the ability to go on to a normal life. I would far rather focus on treatment than on permissiveness on the hard drugs.
Puff, puff, pass. Brian Jean.
Well, I actually don't want to focus on the treatment. What I want to do is focus on the prevention. And you know what, folks, we have to look at what's happening. 3 overdoses a day, 3 or 4 suicides a day from our children. People on the streets living in conditions that are not acceptable for anybody in our current situation. Our country, our province is amazingly rich, and we should be taking care of those people. How do we do that? If I'm Premier, I'm immediately going to mandatory 30 minutes a week for grades 6 through 12 on mental health and how people reach into a box and grab mental health tools. Teachers can be trained on these things. It's basic mental health skills, and each child would have the opportunity to know how to deal with things like depression and suicide, death, divorces. We as a society don't take mental health seriously enough. I am going to take it very seriously. Let's focus on prevention, not the problem.
Thank you. Mr. Toews. Toews.
All right, I would absolutely not be in favor of legalizing hard drugs. I wasn't in favor of legalizing marijuana. Marijuana is an entry-level drug and often leads to further drug addiction. And even right now, there's more and more research that shows as marijuana is consumed by our youth, it leads to very serious mental health challenges and physical challenges down the road. My whole effort and approach would be protecting the youth from the use of drugs, the harmful effect of drugs, full stop. That includes marijuana use, but that especially includes hard drugs. We absolutely have to protect our youth. And yes, treatment's important because we do have an addictions issue in this province. We need to ensure that we have enough treatment spaces. We promised Albertans 4,000 treatment spaces. We're now delivering 8,000 treatment spaces. Friends, we have to bring those that are caught in the cycle of addiction up out of that cycle. That's our moral duty.
Our final segment is A Just Alberta. Mr. Jean, in 2018, Okotoks rancher Eddie Maurice was charged by the RCMP for shooting and wounding Ryan Watson, who was stealing from his property. After massive legal bills and public outrage, the case against Mr. Maurice was eventually dismissed. Nearly 2 years later, Ryan Watson actually sued Eddie Maurice, although that court action eventually failed. In fact, I believe Mr. Maurice is actually here today. Stand up, Eddie, if you're here. Where is he? Where is he? Ryan Watson was later charged with possession of stolen property, possession of drugs, failure to attend court, and just 2 months ago was charged again in Strathmore with breaking an entry, theft, and a number of other crimes. But in 2018, it was Mr. Maurice who was deemed by the RCMP to be the real criminal and faced by far the most severe legal charges. What would you do as Premier to protect the right of self-defense and to shield people like Mr. Maurice from prosecution?
Thanks for the question. Well, first of all, there is the opportunity for self-defense. Now it's in the criminal code, which is governed, of course, by the federal government, and they decide what goes in that criminal code. I spent 3 years on the Justice Committee, so I did have some opportunity to see what happens. And I will tell you what really bothers me here is that he had to do that in the first place. If we had enough police officers in rural Alberta, he wouldn't have had to. And now we're talking with other people on the stage and other people that are in this leadership race about getting rid of the RCMP in rural Alberta. 71 communities don't want to get rid of it. Why are we not listening to them, folks? We don't have enough police officers now. We can have a hybrid model. We can have provincial police, we can have city police, which we have now, and we can have the RCMP and more officers on the street. But what we also need to do as a province is make sure that when our RCMPs actually find somebody, they can pursue them. Right now, we have a mandate from the provincial government saying no pursuit. No pursuit. Can you believe no pursuit? I think it's crazy. Go get them, guys. That's what I would do.
So I promised the candidates my very next full question is about police, but I want to focus on self-defense in this particular and protecting Albertans from prosecution who engage in self-defense. Ms. Smith.
I thought you were asking me again.
No. Okay, Ms. Smith.
Okay, I think ultimately because the Crown dropped the charges, that shows us that they didn't think they'd be able to get a conviction. That says to me that in Alberta, we have a cultural difference that they might have than what they might have in urban Toronto. And as a result, we do our policing a bit differently and we do our prosecutions a bit differently. I regret that that Eddie had to go through that, because I think they could have stalled that out. They could have looked at the circumstances and chosen not to prosecute rather than put him through the circumstance that he did. But the bigger issue is, why do we not have an effective RCMP police response? And I have RCMP in my community. I told you about the gun grab. I didn't tell you that they also closed my detachment down at 10 o'clock at night. So when Raj and Bob have their store shoplifted, it takes a neighbor to sit on the chest of somebody until the Okotoks detachment sends somebody in. We are not getting good service in rural Alberta. You may not feel that way in Calgary, but I can tell you that we have to do a better job, and I believe in Alberta Provincial Police will do it. It's why we need to bring them in.
Mr. Toews, I promise the next question will be about police, but this question is about self-defense and prosecution of people who engage in it, like Mr. Maurice.
Sure, I do think the question is linked a little bit. Answers are linked. I recall back in the day when Mr. Maurice was basically cleared of any criminal activity. That was a good day for Albertans, but Eddie shouldn't have had to have gone through all of that. He shouldn't have had to gone through all of that to defend his property. Right now in Alberta, rural crime is an issue, and it's a complicated issue, but it's an issue. And that's why I believe it does intersect with an Alberta Police Service. I'm on record as supporting an Alberta Police Service for the very reasons that the RCMP, I believe, have a culture of risk aversion that undermines enforcement in rural Alberta. There's also a shroud of bureaucracy within the RCMP that undermines enforcement in rural Alberta. I believe an Alberta Police Service, a service that answers to Albertans, will be more effective at reducing rural crime.
Well, I promised you we're going to talk about police. Now we're going to talk about police. Mr. Toews, in the 2020 Fair Deal panel recommended that Alberta should replace the RCMP with its own police force. The government said that it would study the idea, but no action has been taken beyond that study. During the campaign, you've said, and you literally just said again, you support the move, but the cabinet in which you were in has not acted. As Premier, when would the studies end and the transition to an Alberta police force start?
Yeah, I would commit to immediately work with municipalities to bring them along, because, you know, municipalities are partners in enforcement right across rural Alberta. And I believe there's a great business case and a great case from an enforcement standpoint, from a rural crime reduction standpoint to be made. I would start that process immediately, because an Alberta Police Service, I believe, could again operate more effectively, efficiently, and without that culture of bureaucracy that creates a glacial response for RCMP members, and without that deep culture of risk aversion that I believe undermines enforcement. Look, our ranch was robbed about 6 weeks ago. A couple of side-by-sides, a quad, a shop full of tools right in the middle of calving season. Rural crime is an issue. We need to take real action, and Alberta Police Service is part of the remedy.
Ms. Smith, you've said just now and before that, well, there we go. Speak of the devil, and he shows.
Every time she wants to talk, the siren starts.
And response times are better in downtown Calgary. You've said you support an Alberta police force replacing the RCMP. Well, let's talk details.
Yeah.
When would that transition begin? When would you give notice to Ottawa that you're ending the contract with the RCMP? And when would we expect to start seeing an Alberta police force in rural Alberta?
Well, I took a look at our UCP policy book, and I believe we get our direction from our members, and our members have told us that they want an Alberta provincial police to either augment or replace our RCMP. So why don't we start with augmentation and start right away? And I can tell you where I would start stationing our Alberta Provincial Police. Number one is that if you've ever been to Hardisty, I know that Travis was there earlier today. This is a place where $110 billion worth of value goes through our tank farms. They've shut down their school, they've shut down their hospital, and they don't have an RCMP detachment any closer than 45 minutes away. Can you imagine? I have to wonder how many other communities in rural Alberta are are underserviced that way. That would be the place that I would begin. I would also like to see our Alberta Provincial Police trained in being able to respond to mental health and addiction calls, because that's 50% or more of the calls that they're responding to now. And we've had 3 tragedies in Calgary about an inappropriately aggressive response. If we can start training our Alberta Provincial Police in that kind of response, they can help out in Calgary and Edmonton too.
Mr. Jean, you've been a bit more tepid in your position on replacing the RCMP. You said you want to leave it in place, but create more of an auxiliary force that could be used by small urban municipalities. Perhaps I'm mischaracterizing.
No, I believe in freedom of choice. My theme of my campaign is autonomy for Albertans. Freedom of choice means, why don't we let the rural municipalities decide if they want a premium service that costs them $250,000 an officer? Why don't we decide that? Because this is about money, folks. This is about money. They cost a lot less, provincial police forces. But I believe in autonomy. If they want to spend their budget on an RCMP officer, why don't we let them? I can see over time a move towards a provincial police force. I can see that. I don't have a problem with that. But let's make sure we have enough police. And let's not tear them out of the rural communities that want them. I'm sure the 71 communities that signed that letter are serious about it, or else they wouldn't have signed it. Why are we dividing rural and urban? We're in Calgary here, folks. If you want the city police of Calgary, you got them. Keep them. But let us keep the RCMP if we want them, okay? Thank you. Freedom of choice.
Thank you. All right. I want to finish us off with a nice, easy topic that shouldn't have anyone too angry at each other, so we can all be friends again, okay? Let's talk about abortion. I'm pretty sure I know what you're all going to say. It's federal jurisdiction. I promise not to touch it. Province can't do anything anyhow. Okay, we've got that out of the way. So let's talk about what does fall directly under Alberta's jurisdiction. Before the last election, the NDP passed a so-called abortion bubble zone law that banned any kind of protest within 150 meters of an abortion clinic, even though harassment of that kind that they cited was clearly already illegal. At the time, the UCP caucus refused to vote on the bill. In the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the NDP have called for the building of many more abortion clinics across Alberta. On the other side, pro-life groups have said that the Alberta government should not be spending taxpayers' money on elective abortions. Ms. Smith, as Premier, would you maintain the NDP's no protest legislation, and would you remove taxpayer funding of elective abortions?
Look, guys, I know that this is a very heated issue, and I don't think that we find a solution where we can find some common ground by having these points of conflict like this. I have spent my whole career trying to find ways that libertarians and social conservatives can find areas that they agree on. So I would hope that we would not have to revisit that issue, because I think that that creates an environment of conflict which can escalate, because you're dealing with a very sensitive issue of life. My view is that we need to be focused on what was the original promise was that abortion would be safe, legal, and rare. And I would like to see us spend more time and effort in supporting women to make a different choice with adoption. I think that's the way that you unite. There's a lot of families. I know one in southern Alberta who has spent $50,000 doing a private adoption. If we can make sure that women know that there's that option available, I think that that's a way that we can unite our choice movement and our life movement.
Okay. Mr. Toews, would you repeal the no protesting legislation, and would you ever consider removing taxpayer funding of elective abortions?
What I'll say right off the bat, and I'm happy to say this every time I'm asked, my personal position on abortion, my personal view would put me in the pro-life camp. And I'm happy to legitimize that position every time I'm asked. But I recognize it's a complicated issue, and there's passionate positions held by really good people right across the spectrum. So I would do a number of things. I would focus on expanding conscience rights for healthcare providers so that healthcare providers don't have to ultimately undertake services and activities that breach their conscience. I would also further support expectant mothers, especially mothers who might find themselves with an unintended pregnancy. And I would look to make I would look to make adoption far more streamlined so that children who need a good home can find a good home with loving parents. That would be my approach.
Last softball question to you, Mr. Jean. Would you as Premier repeal the no protest legislation, and would you ever consider removing the taxpayer funding of elective abortions?
The number one priority of government is to keep the public safe, and public policy would be, in this particular case, to not have conflict between two groups that have conflict on a constant basis. And I think removing that would see constant problems, and I would not remove that. I am pro-life as well. I lost a child, and I tell you, if you want to be pro-life, that's the situation that'll make you pro-life. And I think that we should do exactly what these two people have said. I've come forward with a concrete plan on this. I think we should. I've done adoptions. They take 2 years, 3 years sometimes to do an adoption where everybody's in favor of it. Why are we doing that? Why are we not providing more supports for the people that are actually doing the adoptions? Let's quicken them up. 3 months. Let's have a special judge do that. I can get that done. I know how to get that done, folks. One special judge, just like a surrogate judge that hears them by phone. These can be done. They don't need to see them in person. They don't have to wait for them to come. Safety nets for young mothers. That's where I want to focus. Let's make sure that people have another option. They can finish school. They can go to work. They can do what they need. The government needs to supply housing and education for these people. Thank you.
Thank you. You guys have been pretty good. We're right on time.
That must be you.
Well, 1 minute closing statement each. I'll try not to interrupt you with more questions. Mr. Travis Toews, first closing statement to you, 1 minute.
Sure, good. Well, thank you all for your engagement tonight. Engagement matters. Thank you for being committed to this movement, because this movement has the solutions for the province. It's fundamentally important that we remain united and that we elect a leader who can win in 2023, that we elect a leader that exercises sound judgment to keep this party together, to ensure that we can deliver good government and be Albertans' best choice in 2023. I believe right now we need stable, responsible, proven leadership. Friends, that's the leadership I will provide. And I'm confident that if we can elect that type of leader, we can be successful in 23. And based on everything I could see from my vantage point as the Minister of Finance, if we do that, friends, Alberta's best days are ahead. Let's seize this moment. Let's seize this opportunity together.
Next closing statement to Danielle Smith, 1 minute.
Thanks so much, Derek. I think if we wanted to have the same kind of leadership we've had over the last 3 years, we wouldn't be in the middle of a leadership race. There is a time when we want stability. Absolutely there is. But there is also a time when we need to fight. And now is a time that we need to fight. We have Ottawa, who has imposed economic sanctions on us. In November of 2015, they're the ones who started a constitutional crisis. Every single time we have tried to battle it, whether it's been through writing letters or trying to be diplomatic or sending a delegation or going through court, we have been given the door. It's been slammed in our face. The latest one with the Equalization referendum, they gave us Stephen Guilbeault, probably the most anti-oil and gas and anti-fertilizer environment minister we could ever possibly imagine. We need someone who's going to be tough with Ottawa. I have been an opposition leader. You know that I can be tough. I don't want to be tough with my colleagues here. I love fighting Liberals more than I like fighting Conservatives. So vote for me and we'll put Alberta first.
And the final closing statement to Brian Jean, 1 minute.
Thank you very much for inviting me here tonight. The theme of my campaign is autonomy for Albertans. I'm pushing for more autonomy because that's the tool that we use to get Albertans happier, healthier, more free, and more prosperous. Folks, these aren't just words. This can be done. It is entirely possible. And autonomy is the tool that gets Albertans these great things. Let's fight injustice in Ottawa. Let's fix the Constitution. That's what it's there for. It's the agreement that governs us all. We need to open it up in order to fix what ails us here in Alberta and across the country. Let's ensure Albertans have more control over their own affairs. Let's renew this party, revitalize it, and make sure that we are in a position to take down the NDP in the next election, because I don't like Liberals, but I like NDP members even less. I'm the guy to fight the NDP. I know Rachel Notley, and I will make sure that she does not win the next election. Let's return to civility and start treating each other with respect again. Let's get this done, folks. BrianJean.ca. I will get it done for you. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. If the candidates could just take back your stools here for one moment, and we'll be wrapping up. Just one moment. What a fantastic debate. Let's give all the candidates a round. Thank you for coming. Tonight, we saw the three frontrunners for the leadership of the United Conservative Party lay it out for us. I hope that tonight's debate will help those of you here and those of you watching at home make a more educated choice about who you believe is best fit to lead Alberta. I also want to thank our sponsors one last time, the Alberta Community and Cooperative Association, Credit Unions Alberta, and the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Please give them a round, because without them, there would be no debate tonight. And while I've got you captive for another moment, I want to remind those of you who are not yet members of the Western Standard that you should be. The Western Standard is Alberta-based, and we refuse to take a penny of the federal government's media bailout. We rely on the free transaction of money from people who wish to purchase a product that we create. I call it capitalism. And speaking of capitalism, tonight's venue, Rooftop YYC, is a good locally owned Calgary business, and they have very, very generously given us the space for tonight on the condition that I promise that all of you would live up to your reputation as Alberta Conservatives and drink a lot of beer. So please stay for supper, order some drinks, and enjoy some fellowship. Candidates, please stick around so that you can scrum with the friendly local Calgary media here tonight. Thank you all for joining us. God bless Alberta.